Our panel today has a lifetime of experience dealing with cyber situational awareness, has a keen understanding of its importance, and will no doubt give you some actionable items you can take away to improve your organization's security profile. With all that being said, I'd like to introduce Scott Foote, Joel Jacobs, and James Rinaldi. Joel was the CIO of MITRE for almost 17 years and oversaw the popular MITRE attack framework, which is world-renowned. He now sits on many boards and does high-end consulting, including virtual CIO roles. And I didn't know until I looked into Joel's background that there was such thing as a CIO Hall of Fame. So welcome, Joel. Jim also has a vast experience on the topic today, and he served as the CIO of companies or organizations such as NASA, the FDA, the IRS. And the first thing I saw when I researched Jim, and we talked a little bit about this in his background, is that he recently just got his first hole-in-one. Scott, our internal Apexa virtual CISO, is the CEO of Phenomenati. Scott has over 30 years of industry experience, and I get a kick whenever I'm talking with Scott. I'll hear a world-known event on the nightly news, and I know that particular event that occurred ends up on his desk. He's recently done some consulting with the Department of Defense, with NATO. I've done many of these events with Scott, and I always see in the chat that this is the best facilitator they've ever seen for any cybersecurity topic. So, so with that being said, well, before I introduce Scott or turn it over to Scott, Phenomenati is a great resource if you're looking for virtual CISOs, chief privacy officers, virtual CIOs. If you're looking for risk level agreements, assessments, any high-end security consulting, they're a great organization, and we're proud that they're our partner. So without further ado, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Apexa, for hosting us. So we're going to start with the concept of cyber entropy. And I'll say 35 or plus years ago, one of my mentors, as I was trying to get my arms around, at that point, digital equipment, computers, and doing things like chasing nation state actors on infrastructure, my boss at that point in time came to me and he said, the first thing you need to do, Scott, is give your enemy a name. And I thought, that's kind of an unusual thing here. I'm looking at bits and bytes and hexadecimal, code. He said, no, give your enemy a name. It helps to make it concrete in terms of describing the problem, because the problem's too complex. It's too multidimensional, too multifaceted. If you can come up with an operational concept, new word, but applied back to the way he was coaching me, he said, start by naming it, and then the evolution of that description can take place as you learn more and more about that adversary or the problem. So Phenomenati's come up with this term cyber entropy, and it's specifically to deal with the sprawl that CIOs in particular, but the CISO as a sidecar to the CIOs, we wrestle with it as well. And that is the fact that our environments are continuously moving. They're continuously evolving. Most CIOs get hired with a nice, neat job spec. You're in charge of all this stuff. You're expected to take good care of it all. Wonderful. And by the time they're actually signed on, negotiating the offer letter, already we've got scope creep. Whether it's in networks or systems or data or users or software, already we've got scope creep. That's the entropy we're talking about. And that was bad. Joel was sharing an experience with me earlier this week, talking about in a place we used to work, MITRE, where they have a piece of equipment from the old Sage system, where Sage happened to be for air threat, but a single bit could be held between your hands in a metal box. There was a single bit representation. And my God, if we get 8 of those things, we're going to fill up the tabletop here. That was entropy in that point in time. Think about how far we've come. That was only 50 or 60 years ago now. And think about how far we've come, where today data moves so quickly, a CIO barely knows what they have for data, let alone all of the systems. And forget about this idea of a perimeter. Can you even point to a perimeter anymore? So what I wanted to do is start off our 45 minutes or so here by talking about experiences we've all had along those dimensions of growth. let's start with the perimeter, and let's start with the network itself. And I want to reach out, I guess, Jim, let's start with you in terms of your experience watching this evolution and how the perimeters have been dropping and the network is frankly losing its physical concrete edge. Can you share some thoughts about that dimension of entropy?
Yeah, I can. I think networks, I come from the days where networks were something you could really manage and control to a large degree because of the technology limitations of it. And as we got further into newer technologies and of course the internet, things became a little bit more uh, enabled, which was a good thing, but also security was an afterthought. And so the networks of today, morph and are many different networks in a lot of instances. And in my experience, it's been one of how do you create the right network for the right purpose and have segmentation to help secure, the topology, if you will, of equipment and devices where and humans where you don't want them to cross over necessarily. So I have seen certainly things spread, new things happen, and I would tell you with the advent of 5G, you're going to see even more of that capability expand. Where and unfortunately, thanks to the pandemic, we have a workforce that actually can work from anywhere, and that means on any network almost. So you really do have to look at the technology, not just in from outside in, perimeter in, but also from in out, and consider the person's home environment as or wherever they're working from as a security risk.
And everything that climbs around on those networks. And Joel and I do a lot of phone calls for clients where their insurance companies are asking them about that sprawl and about that segmentation. And their expectation is of the traditional mindset. Do you segment your networks in terms of the classifications of data moving through those portions of the network? So, Joel, can you share some of your experience? I know you've dealt with segmented networks along this boundary, but reflect on that, what we've done inside of federal government, highly managed, very clear perimeters versus what we're seeing in the commercial space today, where devices come and go faster than bits.
Yeah, relying on physical separation of networks is just going to, it's harder and harder. That's not true in the highly sensitive environments that you talked about, and that you mentioned in the federal space, because there's air gaps between levels. But in the case of most commercial environments, the ability to do classic looking network segmentation is really largely impossible. It's you are primarily getting a path to a cloud provider that's a software as a service part of your environment. That's not really only your environment. It's Amazon's or Google's or Microsoft's or SAP that you're trying to get your employees and even your clients, your customers, to get connected to. So you're providing a path, and the idea of having a physical separation across that environment is not a network division. It's really a data flow and controls kind of division, so that you're putting the controls on where the data flows, not how the network is connected.
So let's think about that one in terms of the shadow IT topic. Everybody on the call's probably heard that term now for well over a decade, more like two. Yeah. But this whole idea you just touched on, Joel, the idea that services, not just software being used, but services that you're passing data back and forth, it's moving back and forth across that traditional perimeter with abandon, right? And as CIOs, it's happening even without our approval. Or as CISOs, we haven't gone through vendor risk management and said that's authorized. Let's authorize the connection, but only for that data type. That continues to happen, and we don't even know. That's part of this expanding scope to our jobs, that we look at it and find out about it usually when something bad happens. But it's implicitly expected from our leadership teams that we're on top of that.
I prefer the term feral IT, in that there's a wild west, but the fact is that corporate IT isn't the only one subscribing to services, and in fact, they probably don't. It's very likely that corporate IT won't even know they exist. Some of the services that people are subscribing to that are actually getting used for what's probably proprietary or client confidential or customer confidential data.
Jim, how have you seen that from a shadow IT perspective, but specifically like in the commercial spaces you're spending time advising people now in?
Yeah, well, you certainly see that quite a bit in the commercial side where you're dealing with a lot of legacy, and you're dealing with things that have already happened, and trying to retrofit security in that kind of environment costs more money, and it costs a lot of effort and time, and not everybody gets that. And so it becomes much more of a challenge to put in the new architecture that gives you a new way of securing. I like the idea of knowing what's touching the network. I've always liked that. And that is, I think, a critical element of a network is what is getting on the network and what are they getting to. And this idea of having a smarter network and having edge computing and client devices that are informing the network, I think is really the best way to go forward in the future, starting now, quite frankly, so that you have a chance at putting the right controls in place to manage that complex environment. But I think the future is going to be interesting also because you may not have traditional networks as we know them, and you may have to configure networks out of different types of ISPs than we were used to, including cloud vendors. So I think it's going to get, if you don't have your plans in place now, and this is what I see with a lot of commercial firms, companies, if you don't have that in place now with the right expertise, it's going to be harder to have it ready when users demand a different level of responsiveness. And we all know data is growing. We're talking exabytes now, and that's not going to stop. So how are you going to manage that flow of information to making sure it gets to the right place?
You say two words there that really spawned some thinking in my head. First was complexity. I don't remember if you had said it or Joel had said it, but complexity of systems today is it is orders of magnitude, more complex, intertwined, distributed than it's ever been before. I mean, mission critical systems, not simple information systems, but that complexity is a huge part of this entropy because now you have a shared responsibility model. But if you don't even know you're partnered with someone to provide the service, then how do you know who's responsible for it?
That's a great point, Scott. I have to tell you, I remember the days of worrying about what servers were under people's desks. That was nothing compared to now. Where's your data in a vast amount of cloud out there? And as Joel indicated, whether it's an SAP or some other SaaS or something localized that's to a organization, a functional organization that you may not have privy to. And here's the kicker, is how many people are good at reading contracts to understand, what the implications of your data being in somebody else's hands are. And that's believe it or not, that's a cyber issue.
It really is. And we're running into this challenge all the time as well. We get asked by insurance companies as the simplest example because they go right at it and say, what data have you got? Where is it? Where's it going? What relationships do you have? Show me the administrative controls in your contracts, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And that is a dimension that most people don't think about. When we talk about cyber entropy, they're thinking perimeter, physical devices, protocols, networks. They think of the things that used to be very tangible. But data itself, I spend a lot of time as the privacy guy chasing that data. Hang on, what data do we get? Do we ask for that data? Do they just send it to us? And how long do we hold it? What's the retention? How do we protect it? When do we delete it? How do we prove we've securely deleted it? Joel, can you talk a little bit about our experience in that space in terms of the bar being set even higher now with obligations on a company, and I mean like a corporate entity who has been trusted or entrusted with all of these types of data, but maybe doesn't even know where they are.
And sometimes don't even know which obligations they are subject to. So the fact that just about every contract the company enters into has some explanation about the obligations that the company is subject to protect data, protect contract data or commercial data, protect privacy data, and so on. They're also subject to regulation and penalties depending on where they reside and where the data, what type of data, and therefore what it's subject to. Most significant relationships between companies are going to include a cybersecurity checklist or questionnaire or something like that. And we've seen up to hundreds of questions on these that include and are trying to target what the data is and what the obligation to protect it is. They often get off into tangents that are frankly retro in their thinking. But the real key is, what are you doing with the data? What data, and what are our expectations, and what are your obligations to protect it? That keeps rising. That's going to continue to rise. And what we're seeing is that the ability to get through that process of clearing the hurdles of vendor risk management in both directions, both on the sell side and the buy side, are rising. So there exist attempts to simplify and take some of the friction out of that part of the negotiation in arranging commercial agreements or appropriate agreements depending on the organizations.
And the sprawl there from all the international privacy laws is really shining a light. Now, we should have been taking care of it all along, but GDPR and all the other privacy regulations that are coming out force this right to the forefront. They force us to codify this in our contracts and our agreements, but just reflecting on watching companies that we've been pulled in to support, watching them deal with what's the classification, right? What's the retention? PII is one of my favorites because I'm a privacy guy, and I won't bore you with that today, but we talk about the privacy pinata. All right, I'm going to bore you with it. So the privacy pinata is that the marketing department said, we want everything. Yeah, it's Mike. He's the marketing department. We want everything about every user that ever comes by, touches a website, pings a service. They want to gather it and keep it and, use it for analytics and carve it up and you name it. And of course, retain it. We never want to drop it. Well, in comes the DPO saying, wait, that's a privacy pinata and it's at risk because you're attracting adversaries like flies. They know we have the data and they know that it puts the business at risk. They want to expose that data, compromise it, and then extort us. So the data dimension should not be one that's overlooked when we talk about cyber entropy. And when we talk later about cyber SA, situational awareness, we as CIOs and CISOs, we've got to have some understanding of all this data. Where is it? What is it? Who's got it? When's it moving? Why is it moving? Why are we still holding on to it? Did we even need it in the first place? We are now obligated to report out to the authorities when they come knocking and say, we have a report from a data subject and we want to see, are you actually adhering to our extraterritorial regulation because the data subject was in our territory. This is
Scott,
something that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
No. Go
I
ahead.
was just going to add to. I think the interesting thing that has also increased scope is operational technologies, and technologies that are usually outside the control of a CIO, but they're functional to, and very important to a business, and that could drive a lot of IoT. It could drive, all kinds of. It could be HVAC. Could be all kinds of technologies that are now digital that generate data, but also could be a point of entry. And so do we have the tools to help us manage those type of environments for the same purposes that you just discussed. You know, what type of data, where is it coming from, and is there a vulnerability there? And most people, that is an afterthought, and it's not architected for what an IT environment may just look like. So that increases the scope for CISOs, as well as in many cases the CIOs, for in case there's a breach, you know, all hands on deck, and you just don't know where they could come in and bring those kind of vulnerabilities to fore. So it's good to understand the IT topology, but that IT topology now has, to your earlier point, has now expanded to beyond traditional IT.
Very much so. The thing that comes to mind as you're talking about that, Jim, is the target breach. I think it's very well known that the adversary got in by coming in on a laptop of a contractor that was doing work on an HVAC system, but for some reason, there was little to no network segmentation. That HVAC system got all the way out to the point of sales devices throughout the company. So, and that's all public, but that was done because of the assumption there was an acceleration of business. They took on the risk by connecting all these things. There was significant value to the business, but it was done so without the oversight of the CIO or CISO to say, hold on. If we're going to connect all these things together, I've got to build myself some ability to have controls in place to at least monitor, if not block traffic. It's always an afterthought, as Jim says.
Yep.
The last piece, in terms of just admiring the cyber entropy, and I know I could go on for hours about this because this is the world we live in. We're constantly counting goldfish in the ocean, and no, goldfish don't swim in salt water. Everybody loves to point that out when I bring up the analogy. Point is that one of the things we often forget about until we've done an audit or until we frankly get popped and a service account is used or exploited, but it's privilege sprawl. The idea that privileges continue to get built up along the way. An individual continues to pick them up with new roles. Even our contractors, you talked about OT, the fact that we have third parties coming into our corporate gateways, getting onto our floors to update the software on a lathe. They have privileged access to a device, to an intelligent compute device on our operational floor. We as CIOs and CISOs don't even have control over the privileges as they're sprawling in this environment. We talk about this perimeter, and one of the main things we see that is replacing the physical air gaps is the fact that these identities and the privileges they move back and forth with, that really winds up being where our edge becomes. What identities and privileges do we actually control? And what is controlled by our partner, the shared responsibility model? So there's continuous creep in every dimension of the space. And as I said, we could talk for quite a while about it, but this is now the attack surface of the 20th century, frankly, of even here in the 2020s, we're seeing things that were never even thought of in terms of this could happen when most of these network protocols, devices, and components were originally conceived. We never thought of the brittle system. Sorry, Joel, go ahead.
I was gonna touch on the privilege sprawl. Some of it is because people haven't really focused on it. It's not a point of emphasis. It's easy to add privilege, and it's hard to remember to revoke it downstream, as an example. We learned over the last couple of years, especially because in negotiating cyber insurance with clients, that it's not unusual for software vendors, even within the IT space, not IoT space, but I suspect that's true too, that software vendors are likely to tell a customer that this needs privileged access in your domain in order to work properly, because it's easier for them to set it up, as they're not having to be surgical in the entitlements and controls and privileges. And as it turns out, that's not true often. It's just harder, because you have to make sure that the appropriate things can talk to other things without the privilege, without the advantage of having the privilege. And what we found on from the insurance side is they're onto this now. They know that this is a vulnerability. They know it's really scary, and they're not going to insure you with certain things that are pretty clear that gain advantage for adversaries, and additional privileged accounts in order to run specific software packages is one of them, and they'll take it. Adversaries will take advantage of it, and insurers won't want to take that risk. They're really clear on that. The other part is the ability to make sure that end of life things, whether it's hardware or software, unpatchable assets in the environment are pretty ripe for exploitation. And so if you're not taking care of finding out what you have and whether it's supportable and patchable, you're leaving windows open in the process. Lowercase w.
That time dimension, Joel, thanks for bringing it up because I'd forgotten about it. But that is, so in a different world, I talk about the 7 vectors of cyber threat intelligence, or cyber intelligence rather, period. And the one that always trips people up, especially traditional IT staff, is it's a 7th one. I talk about temporal intelligence. And they look at me like, it's just a big marketing word. Well, no, it actually means, in my world, it means knowledge of how to screw with someone's clocks and, screw up their whole logging environment. But in the larger scope in business, every single thing we've talked about, network systems, data itself, even a privilege should have a life cycle. Every one of these things should have a deliberately managed life cycle. The privileges should be granted, used, recorded, the use of the privilege, but then deprecated. The system should have a planned life cycle, because where we ignore the life cycle or the temporal vector of all these things, that's where things age. And of course, it's ripe picking for a sophisticated adversary. They don't look at the brand new systems that are well fortified. They go to all that legacy stuff that Jim was talking about, and they look to see where they can exploit something that's frankly just been forgotten or overlooked.
Yeah. Scott, it's really the dilemma I faced as a CIO in having cybersecurity responsibility was I have the customer and I have the workforce experience to balance against the tighter controls. And you get caught in that discussion of, well, you can lock it down so much that you can't get your job done, or you could go by a risk-based approach, which I think is a much more eloquent way to handle it, so that those privileges are timed, to your point and Joel's point, that that they get what they want during a short duration, and then they lose that privilege without changing the experience for them or making the experience negative. Everybody has to face that at some point, and it's a tougher issue for the CIO who's caught, quite frankly, in the middle. I cry no tears for my brethren CIOs, but at the same time, it is realistic to that sprawl we're talking about, the entropy you're talking about, and what the experience people want. And in IT, quite frankly, and the vendors also have not reached that point of sophistication yet to balance all of that so that you're mitigating the right risk and you're addressing the right risk. And I think that's something I dealt with, and I see people dealing with even today as things continue to change.
I like the way you put that, and you're reminding me of a phrase Joel uses often, and I now laugh when he brings it up, but only because it hits the nail on the head. It's like a Scott Adams cartoon with Dilbert. Someone will, be concerned. We come in and we talk about vulnerabilities and gaps and the risks, et cetera, and they get very concerned about exactly what you just described. What's the balance in terms of accelerating the business, pursuing opportunities, and locking things down to reduce the risk?
Right.
And Joel's point is always, we're not looking for ways to say no. We're looking for ways to say yes responsibly. Right. We want to enable business, but we want to do it in a way that accepts risk with eyes wide open, not implicitly, not blindly. And that's
exactly right.
That brings us to the cyber SA topic, the second half of our discussion, which is how do we get that? As CIOs and CISOs that are, constantly counting minnows in the ocean, How can we build that over time? We're never going to have 100% awareness and full contextual knowledge. It's simply not feasible in such complex, highly distributed environments. But in my past, when this was, put on my shoulders with a particular government entity, the first thing I said was they were bringing me numbers of computers. That was basically it, numbers of computers. And then they brought me what was on those computers in terms of operating systems and software and vulnerabilities, as you might imagine. But I had said to them, that's not enough. If you want awareness that's decision quality, you've got to put it in context where I can assess the risk. And they looked at me like, risk? We don't talk about risk. We're, different environment. No, it's all about risk. Because I came from the threat world. I was the guy bringing the threat intelligence in, trying to connect it up with the devices on the networks. And what would a threat potentially try to exploit in terms of vulnerabilities in this environment? That's a superficial explanation, but I was that threat guy, the threat intelligence guy. And I said, well, the first thing you need is threat intel. Network awareness needs to continually be maintained, but threat awareness needs to come to the table. And this is before CTI, cyber threat intelligence, was a commercial, capability. Now we all get it all the time. But the big piece that was missing, and I know both Jim and Joel have had a lot of experience in this world, was the mission piece or the business dependency. We had so many in our consumers, the stakeholders, that would simply assume, well, Jim knows what that device is, right? We have 1,700 Cisco switches and routers. What do you mean Jim knows exactly what that particular router does? Well, he must know. Somebody knows. Those expectations of our knowledge of the dependencies, and to answer the big question was always, so what? Yeah, so the device has been owned, right? We have malware on it. So what was this? That's what the business asks. They don't care the model of the router, the switch, or what was the ingress, or how do we find it, the indicator. They ask us to put it in business terms. Risk. What's the risk to the business? So let's go to Joel and talk about how you've dealt with that question in the past, because I know that's another changing landscape. We're constantly trying to figure out what are the dependencies on this complex infrastructure.
So the challenge there is to be able to articulate it, as you've said, in business terms. What if the adversary is able to get there? What if they are able to exploit the vulnerability that we've left? How do you describe that to the executive suite? How do you describe that to the board? And in sufficient terms that it's not simply trying to scare them, but to help generate an action plan to close the vulnerability, which reduces the probability of the risk being exploited, which then allows you to reduce the risk in relative terms across the environment. And most often, CISOs in particular have a tendency to engage that level of governance with things like firewall rules or the next antivirus product or something like that. I can tell you that I gave a presentation to the board when I was a sitting CIO and CISO and CSO, and accidentally went off into Never Never Land about whether they were safe at Starbucks. And shame on me because I opened the wrong door. But I wasn't trying to talk cyber hygiene, but I mentioned it in a way and opened the door to that path, as opposed to saying, keeping it at our greatest risk are these advanced persistent threat actors, and they want this data, and we have that data, and they presume we do, and we need to close the paths they have to getting it, and then go into the potential advantages we had in defending ourselves and detecting the activities. But if you start with what's the mission intent, and therefore the assets that you have that actors will want to go for, you then have to work back to what threat they are proposing, and the notion of threat-informed defense is really important. and increasingly so, because you can't defend everything equally. You need to have it risk aligned, and that means understanding what the threat actors would be most interested in, and in exploiting you. That further, the challenge there is it's not just the event like ransomware, it's the follow-up, the extortion that follows the ransomware, and the brand impairment. I thought you guys were good at security, and the other side effects that are associated with the consequences of the threat being realized, and therefore the risk being realized.
Jim, how have you dealt with this in the different environments? To the extent, obviously, you can share, because some of these are sensitive, but how have you dealt with the constantly shifting sands of these business dependencies? Because as Joel says, you got to make the investments. It's got to be aligned to risk to the business, which means inherently as a CIO, you've got to be able to map your business systems functions down to the information, and then the information to all that infrastructure it's carried over.
Well,
How have you wrestled with it?
Yeah, that's actually one thing that I wanted to emphasize was the data portion versus just the device. The device is very important, don't get me wrong, but the data, protection was equally, if not more important in my mind, because devices come and go, as we already talked about. So you start looking at, well, how do you secure the data? Who has access? All those things we talked about a little earlier. I will tell you this, as the footprint expanded, and I had to worry about missions and a mission to Mars or a mission around the globe, you have to worry about, how that data is managed and how commands are managed. And so we were able to get on the risk charts for missions, and cyber was an element of that. And that took some doing, believe it or not, because the assumption was I took care of it all. It's all taken care of.
Right.
And so we put it on the chart, and we're looking at roles and have been looking at roles for mission CISOs. CISOs aren't, sorry, my CIO friends, CISOs aren't just prominent under CIOs. They can also be prominent under business areas or non-IT areas as well. And I think necessary and needed. So we had to change our posture on how we look at things and what the checklist is, and apply it to areas that, traditionally they thought I built the biggest fence in the world, they'd be safe. And that fence no longer can hold everybody out. So we changed some practices, we changed some controls, we added more controls. What Joel was talking about earlier, we tried to go with secure by enabling, and that's really where we started. And quite frankly, it was taking hold. We were making great progress. But I do want to bring up one other point, in that we're only as strong as the weakest link. You've heard that many times, and we've been saying it a long time. And so the human element is where you can't necessarily control everything, but you sure can train and give information that's useful. For example, when we all went home to work, even prior to that, we had a large workforce working from remote locations anyway. We would train people how to secure their home and give them toolkits to help them do that. And so the human element plays a role in this. So we can do all the technology in the world, but all the great technology, all the great cyber technology that's necessary out there is important, but it doesn't replace human judgment. And we have to put better processes in and better educate the user, and that includes professionals like myself. I mean, I've been hit before, and you think you know it, but things keep changing, and it shifts quite a bit. So those elements are what I've learned and what I've applied as much as I could, and I advise people today how to change not only the technology, but the behavior that leads to some vulnerabilities.
Scott, I mentioned threat informed, but I also want to mention risk-aligned choices. And I've got a story with Jim from several years ago where I gave a
This isn't the
presentation.
one from Vegas, is it? Because we
No,
can't
no,
have that
no,
on
that one,
recording.
no, no,
Just
that
just to be
stays,
clear.
that stays there. But this one was, I had, I shared, we were in peer organizations, so I shared the equivalent of a risk register that in this forum. Here are the ones that I'm most concerned about. And it was nation state, confidentiality breach, things like that. And I got down to the bottom and I said, I don't care about DDoS. Um, if we're down for a few hours, it's not that big a deal. Yet, but I care more about confidentiality. And I assumed everybody in the room would say, yeah, of course. And Jim said, what the hell's wrong with you? And I was just like, what do you mean? And he said, I don't care about, confidentiality that much. We're mostly about, we're a scientific public interest organization. We share our data with researchers all over the world. We make it as public as we can. On the other hand, DDoS during a landing on Mars is a really bad thing. And if we can't control the spacecraft, then we got real problems. And it set me back on my heels. Like, all right, there's a perfect example of risk aligned to the business, not just from some textbook version about that's only aligned to the highest threat.
I'm really glad you brought that point. I'm sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, first of all, this may be the only time Joel's acknowledged I was right on something. Second is that the point, I really do agree on the risk aligned, and that's one of the hardest things for a CISO and a CIO to get from the community they support, because everything's important. Everything's a priority one. And so protect it all equally. And I don't know any organization that could protect everything equally. If they do, they protect nothing right. And so I firmly believe in what Joel just said about aligning the risk to what's important, and whatever the crown jewels of the company are, whatever that includes the data, technology, people, and doing that. Think about the future, though. Think about your C-suite now in their autonomous cars down the road that can be hacked, and the impact that could be. How many people are planning that kind of thing and aligning risk to, again, the change in technology and the landscape changing so fast? Smart cities. I'm kind of guessing here, smart cities, which I think is a very good idea, as long as it's architected with security in mind. And so that's really the key point I take out of this is, and hopefully people will think about, is in your architecture, think about that alignment, think about that risk, and think about the shifting technology landscape, metaverses, cloud, autonomous, robotics, all those things that now are a lot different than just the device itself.
I'm really glad you both brought that point back, because as we started with the whole cyber entropy and the fear, uncertainty, and doubt of, my God, how do you get your arms around it? We have to acknowledge we never will. Right. We never will get total, complete, 100% knowledge. There is no truth table to check it against anyway, right? Because no sooner have you captured it, it's ethereal. It continues to grow. But what we do make investments in should be informed with decision quality information about those vectors: network, mission, and threat. But those three vectors came up from the risk formula from way back in the 90s. In the risk formula, we said threat exploits vulnerability to produce a consequence. Yeah. That's not a real formula, but the point is we built that as a marketing gimmick to get people to rationalize, what are you going to invest in? You can't prevent the threat, but you better know about it. You can drive vulnerability down. It's never going to get to zero. Your biggest bang for the buck is in mitigating the consequence. So likelihood is a big part of risk, but mitigate your consequence. And that seems to be the common thing across the most successful programs today, are the ones that take the risk, look at the mission awareness or business impact piece, answer the so what questions, then you do the alignment, the prioritization, and work backward from that to say, where can we get to where we agree as a team that risk in this scenario, not all risk, but risk in this scenario is acceptable. more money does not produce significant returns. It's a diminishing return on the investment. So let's stop investing there. And without those dimensions of SA, situational awareness, it's often hard to do that, right? The CISO, we look at the threat picture and think, oh my God, we got to patch everything, got to fix everything, got to lock it all down or forget it. We're going home. And these damn CIOs open everything up. They give data away like it's chiclets. They let everybody in, connect things up. The balance comes there between that business piece is,
right.
come on, let's find a responsible way to get to yes, but it requires comprehensive awareness along all the dimensions we talked about earlier. And that one concept, you hit it so well, Jim. It isn't about absolute. It's about not just relative, but relevant. What is relevant to those big risks for the business? So I know we've pretty much wrapped on 45 minutes plus. Let me just see if Joel or Jim have any last thoughts they want to share with our audience today.
I think we hit the biggest points already. Make sure you understand your risks. Make sure you understand how to put it in terms that the rest of the business, especially senior management, can understand. Deal with the sprawl and know your environment, and don't presume that you know it. Actually, go find out a good understanding of what your environment is that you're responsible for, and understand your obligations. I mentioned before, there are more and more obligations. But what about the contracts you let 3 years ago? Do you know what's still in them? Because it still may apply, and make sure you understand what the modern version of that is.
And so I agree with Joel on that. I want to add a couple of things. The workforce is changing. New workforce is coming in. New capabilities are being added. And if we think about them as they're being developed and secure things as it's being developed, it's a lot easier than trying to go backwards. So work with your different parts of the organization. A lot of functional organizations make IT decisions now. It's not necessarily all under the CIO. And if that's the case, you have to have a different structure, and the CISO has a different accountability. And maybe CISOs report different locations too, different places, and not just to the CIO. And I'm seeing that trend grow more and more because of all the things we talked about. We went through digital transformation, probably some good, probably not some good, but the idea was to use technology to streamline the business. And therefore, the cyber elements of that have to be taken into account. And that is the challenge going forward with the new workforce, new technologies, new capabilities, and new expectations from entry workforce.
These have been very insightful comments, and I'm thinking, I quite honestly, I joke with these guys a lot, but I learn from both of these gentlemen every day as we look both backward and reflect on where we've been and what we've done, but also look forward at what our clients, our prospects, our partners, our friends they are taking on in terms of risk, but new business opportunity. I think it's brilliant, as Jim puts it. Think about that future. Don't just sit back and assume the world is going to be the same. We can prove it's not. Just looking at recent history. So thank you guys both for bringing your expertise, experience, your knowledge and insight to our audience this afternoon. As I said, even though I chat with you guys all the time, I learned every time we have a conversation like this.